Hey, good morning. It's Jeannie Yandel in for Patricia Murphy. It's Monday. This is Seattle Now. There's been a lot of discussion lately about whether Omicron's in retreat and what happens next. So we're starting another week with the question, where are we in this pandemic? We'll ask Jessica Malaty Rivera in a minute, but first, let's get you caught up. Using a fake vaccine card could come with a criminal penalty under a new proposal in the state legislature. A bill sponsored by Shoreline Democrat Jesse Solomon would make using a fake vax ID a misdemeanor. Selling them would be a felony. There will be a virtual public hearing in front of a state Senate Justice Committee later today. New York already has a similar law. Meanwhile, Gonzaga's greatest basketball player is being banned from attending any more home games because he won't wear a mask. The Spokesman Review reports NBA Hall of Famer John Stockton had his season tickets pulled by the school. Stockton has been outspoken against many pandemic public health measures, even showing up in a documentary where he said pro athletes were dropping dead after getting vaccinated. That hasn't happened. The school wouldn't comment on Stockton and referred to its policy that attendees at games are required to wear face masks at all times. Weather-wise, not a lot of rain is on the way this week, but not much sun either. What we are in store for is fog. The National Weather Service says that's thanks to high pressure, lighter winds, and weaker sunlight. They say it's just the foggy time of year. It's in the forecast through Thursday, and it'll be more visible in the mornings and at night. 2 weeks ago on the show, we talked with an epidemiologist we check in with a lot, Dr. Judith Malmgren. And here's what she said about Omicron.
This is the pandemic. We are now in the pandemic. Before was practice.
What she meant was Omicron is so infectious that we're going to see impacts like we haven't seen before. Transmission numbers, hospitalizations. Obviously, this is not what you want to hear going into year 3 of this pandemic. But then, late last week, the UW's Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, also known as IHME, published an article in The Lancet. And that article said, COVID-19 will continue, but the end of the pandemic is near. So what are we supposed to do with assertions about this pandemic from people we consider experts that just contradict each other? Is the pandemic close to ending or not? And does that even matter when it comes to making smart decisions now? Jessica Malaty Rivera is here. She's an epidemiology research fellow at Boston Children's, a senior advisor with the Pandemic Prevention Institute, and until recently was with the Atlantic's COVID tracking project. She's talking with us from San Francisco. Hi, Jessica.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So I want to ask you about some of the details in this IHME forecast, but first, can you give us a level set at all? I mean, where are we in this? Are we in the beginning, the middle, the end?
Yeah, I think this has been a common problem throughout the pandemic of, optimism kind of getting in the way of public health guidance and even precedents. And to be completely honest, I think that we can't be looking at models with any degree of certainty about the future. Models are helpful when they are right, but they're mostly not helpful because they're just models. In that sense that it's not actually predictive, it's, based on the available data, this is what we could maybe see, is how it should be read. Could maybe is a very difficult thing to interpret for a lot of folks. And I think the problem is people are over this, they are exhausted, the pandemic fatigue is overwhelming, but I kind of like to recalibrate those expectations by making it more like a dimmer switch in your mind instead of an on-off switch. And that's a better way, I think, to calibrate expectations.
I like that a lot. I mean, and you're not exactly saying it's not valid to ask whether we're at the beginning, the middle, and the end. This isn't like weather, right, where you can just sort of predict a storm front. But we can talk about intensity levels.
Right, exactly.
So is that what people are talking about when they're talking about the end of the pandemic? Because it's not like COVID just sort of disappears.
Exactly. And I think that there's, a buzzword that's been circulating, endemic, endemicity, and what that means. Then we can go into that. But it's really difficult to think about it being a moment in time because it very likely won't be a moment in time, like an on-off switch where the pandemic is just poof, ended. It's very different from the onset of a pandemic in which you have a date when it's declared. Surely there could be a time in the future where the pandemic part of it will end and we can declare it over. But that does not mean that the disease is gone. And I think that people need to also understand that that's not actually a failure. A disease kind of remaining in a population is not that surprising. We're actually quite used to that. We've got a long history of diseases becoming endemic and circulating for long periods of time. And there are a number of variables that result in that kind of outcome. But when we think about the future, it's not life after SARS-CoV-2. It's life with SARS-CoV-2 in a much less annoying way.
Okay. So let's talk about this word then, endemic. I mean, the obvious joke to make here is it does have the word end in it. Maybe that's messing us up. I don't know.
I think it is messing us up, to be completely honest. Endemic is a very likely outcome of SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. And the reason for that is we can't fully eradicate the disease. If you think about the history of infectious diseases, we've only really fully eradicated two, smallpox and rinderpest. And so because of that, it's going to kind of have to be a evolution, for lack of better words, of figuring out how this disease can become less and less disruptive. So we have multiple epidemics happening at a pandemic level. Endemic will probably look like a combination of things where there's a degree to which the human population, which is, the most important in this context, is less destabilized through infrastructure strain, through overwhelming hospitalizations, through overwhelming deaths, and that we figure out a way in which our hospitals can deal with an influx of cases without it being something that they have to create new crisis of care and triage protocols. We will be seeing infections with SARS-CoV-2 and likely breakthrough infections if more and more people are vaccinated for a long time. But again, it's part of this process of not being able to communicate risk assessment very well and looking at risk as not 0 or 100 or black and white. It's like a spectrum of reduction and not elimination. And so when we talk about what this could look like, it probably looks like we're going to be having, outbreaks of this, but it's not going to cause us to have to change everything and have lockdowns and have different policies. It's going to be something, and I hate these comparisons because people really incorrectly use them, but something kind of like the flu, right? Where flu has become an endemic virus. And flu is very destabilizing when it's a really bad flu season. And we're not saying they're apples and apples at all, but we are saying its behavior and how we are affected by it becomes less and less disruptive.
I'm glad you used the flu as an example. I was actually wondering if that was an example of something endemic that we were dealing with. I was also afraid to say it out loud because it has been twisted so frequently over the course of this pandemic. I do want to ask you a little bit about what the IHME said in its paper that was published in The Lancet. They're saying that probably we will see new variants of COVID. Some could possibly even be more severe. But they also say that after the Omicron wave, COVID-19 will return, but the pandemic will not. And actually, just this weekend, the Europe director for the World Health Organization said something similar about the pandemic in Europe. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and that's where I do agree. I think a lot of times people are thinking very linearly about this as well, and they're thinking we're headed towards a finish line, but that's not necessarily how viruses evolve. Historically, the virus has evolved in what seems to be like a straight line between the alpha, beta, delta variants, but Omicron kind of created its own branch, and it kind of was an offshoot on its own. There are many theories as to how and where that, happened and why. That said, it can happen again. And it's not necessarily true that viruses evolve to become weaker and weaker. Like this, prediction said, and like these analyses say, viruses can sometimes become stronger. Viruses can sometimes evolve to be more problematic. And that's why it's so important that we get this equilibrium of high vaccination and low transmission so that it becomes less and less likely for that to happen. We know that the risk of variants evolving is greatest when you have novel populations with no immunity, where the virus can just kind of spread unchecked, because what the virus is essentially doing is trying to propagate itself. It's making copies and copies of itself. Sometimes it makes those mistakes. Those mistakes are mutations. The more opportunities it has to do that without any sort of barriers like vaccination, masks, any other mitigation policies, the more likely it is that a new variant can emerge. And that's why we have to make sure that vaccine global equity is part of this conversation, because we can't think about this as places becoming pandemic free. It's the globe. It's the whole community.
So just because one country has high vaccination rates, if another country doesn't, we're leaving ourselves globally open to another variant.
Very vulnerable. Very vulnerable.
You know, we have talked about sort of different declarations of the end is near, the end is somewhere. Who makes that decision? Like, who even decides whether we move from pandemic to endemic? Is there a committee somewhere?
The data determines that, really. You know, once we see that there are, you know, not enough people will be immune to like prevent the virus from actually infecting people, or that there's not enough people that are vulnerable to actually cause outbreaks, it will be visible in the numbers. We will see that case counts per capita are stable. We'll see that hospitalization admissions and ICU admissions are not disruptive, where they're causing people to have to wait for endless hours to get care. We will see that the mortality rate will decrease. It's kind of based on data. And I know that that's also my bias, because I spend my time like literally poring over the data every day. But that's where the truth is, right? That's where the actual evidence is. And we can say, based on these trends with a period of time that's long enough to say this is statistically significant, this is pretty meaningful, you know, all things considered, seasonality. I mean, we can see trends increase when it's colder weather, when there's holidays, when people are doing more indoor gatherings. When it is stable kind of throughout a number of those external variables, then we can say, and we as in like the experts who are looking at the data can say, okay, we are transitioning into this new phase of the pandemic, and it is likely becoming endemic now. It is likely actually more localized and not affecting all of the countries in the world.
The thing that I would love to do is tell everybody who's listening what your cell number is so they can text you whenever they have questions. But since that is not a viable option, what's the one thing you would like all of us to do as we try and make heads and tails of information that sometimes feels contradictory, and as we try and sort of stay safe and continue to make the best decisions?
Yeah, I mean, and I said this many times too, and I stick to it, but our individual choices have a huge, huge impact on our collective experience with COVID-19. It is not for nothing that people are having to make sacrifices like deferring celebrations, or, you know, keeping their risk low as mine even, or even getting vaccinated, or even choosing to send their kids back because that's the best thing for their family, but they're doing other things to keep people in their community safe. Those are ways in which we get to the dimmer being less and less bright, right? You know, and I think that people have to remember that each vaccine gets us closer to that. Each mask that's worn in high-risk settings gets us closer to that. Each time you test and you decide to act responsibly based on that test result gets us closer to that. And I think that we could all, as individuals too, do a lot to help be advocates that those luxuries that I just mentioned, things like testing and vaccines and, you know, isolation and quarantine, are available to everybody. I think that we can't ignore the fact that, you know, the WHO declared the pandemic, right? And the WHO right now is screaming from the mountaintops, we are prolonging this pandemic because not enough people have yet to see first and second doses of this vaccine. That is not okay. And if we want this pandemic to end, this is about every single person on this planet who's affected by this disease to have those same luxuries that I just mentioned.
Jessica Malaty Rivera is a research fellow at Boston Children's and a senior advisor with the Pandemic Prevention Institute. Jessica, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Seattle Now. Jason Pagano produced today's show. Matt Jorgensen does our theme music. I'm Jeannie Yandel. Trish is back tomorrow.
An ancient corner of northeastern Portugal has found itself stuck in a kind of ecological arrested development.
What we're missing here is a fully grown forest. That's what this landscape should be covered with. And it didn't have the chance because it's burning too often.
On the next episode of The Wild, I head to the KUOW Valley for a curious story of fires and a mission to bring back an entire forest ecosystem. Listen at kuow.org/thewild or wherever you get your podcasts.